You're listening to the Grassroots Church podcast. We're a Jesus-centered community in Thunder Bay, Ontario. You can learn how to participate more by going to our website at grassroots.church.
We are in our second last week here, and it has been I was just thinking about this as we were singing this morning. Like, we have been saying goodbye to this building for like 3 years now, haven't we? Right? Some of us are like, we kissed goodbye like 3 years ago. We thought that was it, and now here we are. And I don't want to say 100% for sure, but I'm like 95% sure this will be it. Like, we're done, so that's the plan. Anyway, next week will be helpful if you stick around for that. I want to say thanks again to Russell, who's standing at the back there, for sharing last week on Christian maturity. And that message actually is going to tie into this series, I think, really well. I was in BC. I was on Vancouver Island last week at Camp Homewood, which is this camp, with my son, my favorite son, Cameron. And I'll tell you why. Because last week, after Russell spoke, I got a phone call. Where's Graham? Oh, yeah, I got a phone call from this punk. And he said, "Dad, you'll never guess what? Church is over at 11:30. You'd never be able to do that." And so I, of course, hung up on him. And hence why I brought my favorite son to BC and not him. Well, this morning, I'm going to actually begin a 45-part series on, just kidding. This is a short 3-part series on forgiveness. We are not going to be diving super deep into this topic, but I thought that we would spend a few weeks before we really get into the summer. And by the way, summer messages and teachings, it's going to be a different vibe as a community. It'll be more laid back. Backyard kind of gives that aura, and so we're going to lean into that a bit. But right now, we are diving deep into forgiveness. And this has come about primarily from 3 reasons I want to share. So the first reason is that as I was reflecting about my interactions with you as a church community over the last couple of years since I've been in this role, one of the threads that kind of seems to be present is this topic of forgiveness, and specifically a struggle to forgive. Whether it is forgiving people in our lives who have hurt us, whether it's forgiving God, or even forgiving ourselves, it seems like it is something that in many ways holds us back from the life that God invites us into. And so that's number one reason. Number 2 reasons that I also struggle with forgiveness. This is, I think, true for many of us, but I have a very rocky relationship with it. I think I can mentally ascend to the knowledge of forgiveness is a good way to live. But to practice that as a sort of default posture in our lives where we live out and exude grace it's just a really difficult thing to do. And so I am with you in this journey, in this struggle of forgiveness. And then the third thing, and this is sort of practically last week when we were in BC, I spoke at this father-son retreat, and the topic was on forgiveness. So it's sort of fresh in mind. Of course, I was speaking specifically about what it looks like in the context of forgiveness within a father-son relationship and that kind of thing. But the truths, the principles kind of transferred to all of this. And so that's kind of the rationale as to why we are going in this direction. And I am hopeful that you will glean something from this, something that can impact your lives, something that can impact the relationships you have with others and especially with God. So to begin, I want to just begin talking about what we mean by the topic of forgiveness, because there's a lot of different understandings, and so I want us to be on the same page about what we mean. And I'm going to refer to John Mark Comer, who has at least 3 levels of forgiveness. And there we go. So the 3rd level is reconciliation. We'll talk about that in week 3. The 2nd level is us releasing our own hearts and learning to deal with anger and bitterness and resentment and things like that. And then the first level, which is what we're going to talk about this morning, is simply releasing others from the debt owed to you. And this serves as a very good sort of baseline definition of forgiveness. okay? And actually, Rich Velotis, many of you have read him. I know that one of the home groups has been going through a series on 2 Corinthians with him. But this is how he defines forgiveness, and I think it is sort of aligned with what John Mark Comer says. He says, this isn't working great. To forgive is to cancel the debt owed, to forego retribution, to say no to revenge. It is the clear recognition of wrongdoing, but the refusal to continue the cycle of offense. Does that work with everyone? So the idea here with forgiveness, with this sort of like baseline understanding and practice of forgiveness, is simply to forgive debts that are owed, all right? To refuse retribution, to choose not to pay back. And so if you hit me, instead of retaliating with hitting you, I say no more, and I walk away. And it's, what you did was wrong. I can justify, I can argue that was unjustified and so forth, but I refuse to perpetuate the offense or the violence by responding in kind. Instead, I extend forgiveness. I release you from the debt of hitting me. And that is what forgiveness is at its most basic level. Okay. So turn with me in your Bibles, if you want, to Matthew 18. I'm going to have it on the screen as well. But this is a very familiar story to many of us. Peter and the disciples are interacting with Jesus. And let me just read this. It says this: Peter came up to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me?" And then he says, 7 times? Now, Peter is most likely trying to impress the other disciples here as he's doing this. There's a common teaching in Israel at the time that you can forgive up to 3 times a day. That was sort of the practice of the day. And so Peter is like, let's double that and then add a little bit more. Like, that is excessive forgiveness. Like, that's what you're expecting of us, right? Right, Lord? And so he kind of like winks at his other disciples, like, it's a lot, but that's what it's like to follow Jesus. And Jesus, of course, doesn't miss a beat. He responds, no, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. I asked the kids in BC last week. These are little kids. Some of them were teenagers. But I asked the kids, I'm like, what is 70 times 7? And I got some truly bizarre answers. Like 1,048 and like 4,300. And I was like, what kind of education system do they have in BC? And I had to be careful because my wife was educated in BC. But anyway, none of them said 490, which was the correct answer. But you all knew that, correct? Right, Matthias? Yeah, you did. So anyway, does that mean then, was Jesus saying not 7 times, but 77 times? Is he saying that so that when we get to that magic number of 490 offenses against us, we then draw the line and we say, absolutely no more, I am refusing to forgive you? Is that what he's trying to say? Do you think his disciples understood that? Probably not, right? He was not being literal about 490 offenses, and then that's the threshold. That's the magic threshold, and anything after that, we hold on to unforgiveness. No, he's using hyperbolic language. He's trying to communicate a deeper truth here, and the truth he's trying to communicate, he's not giving a number for which we are to keep track of. Because imagine trying to keep track of someone who offends you 490 times. Like it's just not even like realistic. And so, in fact, it's the very opposite of what he's actually asking us. He's giving us such an extreme number, such an obviously untenable situation that would cause us to stop and be like, well, wait a sec, that's not even realistic. And his point is that when we live in such a way as to keep track of every slight against us, when we live in a way that like every injustice that is directed at us, every wrong that is committed toward us, we hang on to that. When we do that, we end up creating a form of prison for ourselves. And so what Jesus is saying, that if we cling to unforgiveness, if we keep tabs, hold account, keep account all the time of all this thing, it begins to become the lens through which we see all of life. And so all we have are these eyes that see the injustices and the slights and the wrongdoings that are directed at us. And sure, there is lots in life to justify that, but that is all we can see. And I'm sure many of us have met people in our lives who see the world through that lens, right? Maybe we struggle with that ourselves, where we just really like to keep tabs on the wrongs that others have committed against us. And so Jesus isn't saying, I want you to count to 490 and then go to 491, and that's where you draw the line. He's saying, listen, don't live in such a way that you even keep tabs at all. Just be willing to forgive. The idea of counting the wrongs against you is missing the point. Just be willing to forgive. He's saying that those who live in the kingdom of heaven, those who follow after Jesus, who profess Jesus as Lord of their lives, they are to become the kinds of people for whom releasing others from the debt they owe is just an instinctive thing. It becomes like the air that we breathe. It becomes like the air that we breathe. You see what I did there? That's the title of the series. It becomes like the air that we breathe. We don't even think about it. So what does that mean? First of all, it means that it becomes so common, such a normative, regular part of how we live, that we aren't even aware of it. We just don't hold on to slights. People offend us and we're like, okay, and we move on. And this is just like magical, it seems, but because it seems so far from my way of living. But this is what he's inviting us into. Like, can we imagine living in a world where none of us hold on to those wrongs? Right? And then the second thing is, just like breathing, if we don't forgive, if we don't breathe, we die. And so if we don't if we don't forgive, we experience a form of death. So let's talk about this first one. Forgiveness becomes so common that we don't even notice it. So forgiveness is a posture that is meant to take place within us, that happens to us, that is part of how we live and interact with the world, that we are not even aware, like inhaling and exhaling air. Now, that's the goal, like I said, but for every follower of Jesus, right? But let's be real. That is much easier said than done. I know I struggle with forgiveness as a practice, let alone a default posture to live by. And I imagine many of you do as well. I won't point any fingers, but I suspect many of us struggle with that. Maybe it's very valid, and I'm not saying it's not. Maybe you've been on the receiving end of some wrong or some pain that runs so deep and so hurtful that to just even forgive that other person or whoever it might be, that to do that is just too much to ask in this moment. And have not walked in your shoes or gone down the roads you've gone down, but chances are, had I or had anyone else in this room walked down the road or been in your shoes, maybe we also would struggle with forgiveness. Like, that's fair. So there's no judgment. There's none of that. Like, there are some truly heinous, evil things that we humans have done to one another, right? And I pray for you if you've gone through that and you are struggling with unforgiveness, and that is awful. And I don't make light of that. And so none of that is being diminished or ignored. However, here's what I am saying. So although there is no judgment or condemnation in the struggle to forgive, Jesus' invitation toward forgiveness is always open. It's always open. All right? That invitation remains. And it's also true, and I think it's worth noting here, that historically, the church and the church world has kind of weaponized forgiveness. And if you've grown up in the church, I think there's a good chance you've seen this, and I think it's frankly kind of just gross. So, you've been hurt, there's a deep pain, and then there's this pressure placed on you by the church world to just forgive and move on, right? Like, it's just super easy, and the onus is on you to forgive the wrongdoer because that's what Jesus wants you to do. But then what ends up happening is we actually just inflict another wound on top of the existing wound that began from being hurt in the first place. And so let me be very clear. Here's what I'm not saying. Forgiveness does not mean we pretend the offense didn't happen, right? That's a really childish and naive way of understanding forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean that whatever was done to you was okay. It doesn't mean you have to trust that person or whoever again tomorrow. Forgiveness does not mean reconciliation is automatic or even promised. And we'll talk about that in a few weeks. And forgiveness does not mean that all the consequences are no longer there either. Forgiveness does not mean that you hand someone the keys to hurt you and we call that grace. That's not forgiveness. None of this is forgiveness. But what Jesus is asking of us, what he's inviting us into, is a way of life, a posture in which we insist that the evil that is done to us does not get the final word in us. Let me say that again. What forgiveness means to Jesus is that the evil, the wrongdoing that is done to us does not get the final word in us. And I framed it this way. Forgiveness is not saying it didn't matter. It's saying it mattered deeply, but I refuse to let this debt deform my soul. Okay? I refuse to let this debt deform my soul, and that onus is on you. That onus is on you. Regardless of the offense, there is this open invitation to pursue the practice of forgiveness, to release others from the debt owed to us, and to extend grace as much as possible. And that all leads to the second point. If we withhold it, we experience a form of death. So when we don't share grace, when we hold back forgiveness, there is sort of a sense of choking. And it's not a death, like a physical death, but it is a death of freedom. I need to unpack this a little bit, but what I mean is when we instinctively learn to forgive, when that practice becomes a posture that we live by, in which forgiveness is sort of the air that we breathe, then we are freed from the prison of unforgiveness. Releasing others from the debt owed us releases us to actually live again. Because at first, and think about sometime you've offended, or sometime you've been offended. Sometimes someone hurt you, and let's say, just think about, we've all got these scenarios and situations in our mind, and maybe you're thinking of something already, but I'm going to encourage you to think of someone right now in your life who's like, this person really kind of hurt me. At first, holding on to that feels like control, right? It feels like there's justice there. It feels like no way am I letting them off the hook that easy. I'm not going to let this go. I'm going to hold on to this. And I get that. We all get that. That's very human. That's instinctual. When someone hurts you, there is something in us that wants to keep the receipt, right? To serve, to show others and be like, look how this person offended me, how I have been slighted, how there has been injustice shown toward me, and look what I am entitled to, right? That's kind of natural, but I'm going to say this, and this doesn't just come from Jesus' teaching, this comes from my own experience, and I'm sure many of you have walked down this road as well. The longer we hold on to that debt, the more that debt starts holding on to us, right? We think we are keeping them in our prison, but the irony is we end up becoming the ones who are living behind bars. We are the ones who are rehearsing the conversation in the shower. We are the ones who are lying in bed, replaying the situation or the scenario over and over again in our heads, and it makes us more and more angry and more annoyed. The other party has probably moved on. Chances are they've forgotten about it and they are living their life. And so you are the one who is imprisoned by clinging to that unforgiveness, right? And Jesus says there is another way. There's another way to live. Not an easy way. It's not a cheap way. It's not a way that diminishes any of this. The hurt isn't being diminished. But there's a way that frees you, that leads to life that Jesus offers, that Jesus says in John 10:10, he says, I've come to give you life and life to the full. What does that look like? Well, it begins by saying, look, I'm not going to hold on to unforgiveness. I'm not going to hold you back. I'm not going to refuse to release you from this debt. That's where it begins. And so all of this, I think, is what Peter is being told. Peter and the other disciples are being told when Jesus says, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Learn to live in a way that forgiveness just becomes the air that you breathe. You're not even paying attention to the amount of times you've been offended. And so he sees this. Jesus says this, and to receive that as a disciple, it would be so bonkers. It'd be so hard to comprehend. And Jesus sees, okay, these guys aren't understanding this. And so he tells them a parable. And just for interest of time, I won't read the whole parable, but the gist of it is this. There's this guy, he's a bit of a shrewd dude, and he owes basically what would be about $1 trillion in debt to the king. Now, it's an outlandish amount of money. But the point of the amount of money is that it is unless you're like Elon Musk in 2026, the first trillionaire, you would not be able to pay back this money ever, right? It is just such an absurd amount of money. And so Jesus says this guy owes him $1 trillion, and the king says, you better pay this back. And the guy says, please forgive me, just have mercy, and I will pay it back, which of course would have been like, okay, how are you going to do that, right? There's no way. And so the king looks at him begging, and he decides to have mercy, and he forgives him. Now, the expectation here would be that this man would be so grateful, so over the moon that he would run outside and he would go down the street hugging and kissing all the people. Just sort of like, remember Scrooge in the Christmas Carol when he survives the night with the Christmas past, present, and future ghost. And it's like he's been given this new lease on life. And so he runs down the street. This is like an old photo of that, like a Christmas card. He runs down the street and he's just like kissing children's heads and hugging everyone. And it's like, you expect that this is sort of what that man, how that man would respond if he was just forgiven $1 trillion debt, right? But instead, he goes outside and he sees a guy who owes him a couple $1,000, like a couple months worth of work. Now, it's not nothing, but it's certainly paybackable. And instead of passing on that grace, he holds him by the shoulder and he demands that, or by the collar, and demands that he pays it back every last cent. And then he throws him in prison until he's able to do so. And the man, Jesus makes this point. He says, be patient with me and I will repay it. It's the exact same thing that this man had said to the king moments earlier. The king had chosen to show mercy. This man does not have it in him. In other words, he withholds grace. He shows the opposite response of what the king had showed to him. And so he receives grace, but then he fails to transmit grace. You follow that? That's what the parable is saying in a nutshell. So what's the point? Jesus is saying you can be forgiven personally and yet still be in a prison of unforgiveness. Again, he knows that freedom and liberty and joy, that those things are found in living a life of forgiveness. and then subsequently allowing that same forgiveness, that grace to flow through you to others, that is where joy is found. And this man is unable to grasp the measure of grace shown to him. And he perhaps then walks out and he is blinded. And many of us are like this. He is blinded because he is obsessed with justice. He is obsessed with rights, making things right. Maybe he's greedy, but I think he's a 1 on the Enneagram, a very unhealthy 1 on the Enneagram, if you know the Enneagram at all. He is just like, there is a way to live, and you need to make things right. Right? Law over grace. And so grace is just not even on his purview. It's not on the radar. So Jesus is saying in this parable, the design of forgiveness, the way that forgiveness works with humans, is that we are forgiven and then in turn are meant to forgive others. We breathe in grace, we exhale forgiveness. We breathe in grace, we exhale forgiveness. That's the pattern of forgiveness. And so he's saying to his disciples, guys, stop keeping score of every time you've been wronged. Learn to forgive, forgive, forgive. And in doing so, you will discover a form of freedom that frees you from carrying around a scorecard, right? Keeping tabs of all the people who have wronged you. Ensuring that life is fair. Because if you've lived for more than 2 minutes in this world, you know that life is not fair. That people kind of suck, right? Including us sometimes. That things don't go the way we want, that justice is not guaranteed. And so holding on to every wrong and every offense and every injustice is a sure way to remain imprisoned. I was just thinking that some of the older folks in my life who I have gotten to know and who I respect and look up to, they discovered this secret a long time ago, it seems. Maybe it's something that life gets you. I don't know, if you're open to the Spirit's leading as you get older. But also I've met people who are older who are bitter and who will not relent. And we know those people as well, right? So I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter how old you are. Maybe it's just something that the Spirit needs to work in our lives. Anyway, the way of Jesus is not to become people who pretend debts don't exist or downplay their seriousness. To be a follower of Jesus is to take the way of Jesus seriously. It's to become people who know what it is to have our own impossible debts released, and then to allow that mercy to shape the way that we see and the way that we treat others in our life. In other words, and I think this is key, grace is not supposed to stop with us. If it does, it means that we're not fully understanding the weight of the debt that we have been freed from. The $1 trillion debt that we've been freed from. And this is where the first servant gets it wrong. He receives mercy, but he doesn't become merciful. He's released from the debt, but he refuses to release anyone else from theirs. And he accepts grace as a gift because grace is beautiful to receive, but he doesn't let it flow through him to others. And so he experiences a form of imprisonment. And Jesus says that's not how the kingdom works. In the kingdom of God, forgiven people become forgiving people. Forgiven people become forgiving people. And so if this is a struggle, which I think many times it is, perhaps the question we need to ask is, do we understand the debt that we have been released from? And this is not a rhetorical question. I mean, do we understand sort of beyond the cliche, I'm forgiven of my sins because of the cross? Great. We've all grown up with that, and somehow it doesn't really move us. And so have we comprehended the implications of the forgiveness granted to us by God? Yes, it is the weight of sin that is lifted from our shoulders. But forgiveness is more than just a private pardon, right? It's God's way of freeing creation from the black and white world of debt, of revenge, of retaliation, scorekeeping, and moving us into the vivid color of mercy and justice and peace. Right? that is a beautiful lens to see the world through. What if that's what it means to be forgiven? What if that's what the cross actually points to, right? Yeah, your sins are forgiven. Okay, that's great. But let's actually step back. Is there something more beautiful that the cross shows us, that the forgiveness of God reveals to us? It reveals that the life of scorekeeping is not ideal. It's not where true life is lived, it's experienced. True life is experienced in the letting go and the relinquishing of all of those problems, all those things that have been thrown at us. And we see Jesus doing that perfectly and beautifully at the cross, right? And the result is a life lived in vivid 24 color. David knew this debt well. He was this deeply flawed man. What was it, 24? Hey? 24 bit. Yeah, I think it could be better. Anyway, David knew this debt well. He was a deeply flawed man, right? He made a lot of mistakes. He lived very selfishly, and there were a lot of people in his life who he affected and who he hurt and killed. And yet this is what he says in Psalm 86. For you, Lord, are kind and ready to forgive. He understood God's nature. He said, abounding in faithful love to all who call on you. And I mean, if it's true that this is who God is, and if it's true that what is meant, that this is what God does, that he is eager to forgive dudes like David, then surely the people claiming to be formed by that mercy should also be the kinds of people in which mercy is rich and flows through us. Amen? Surely forgiven people should not be the ones keeping careful record of everyone else's debts. So we breathe in the love of God that has released us from our impossible debt. And then by the Spirit of Jesus, we learn to release others from theirs. That's the pattern established in this parable by Jesus. That's the way forgiveness is meant to work in us and on us and through us. But that's just the first level of forgiveness. Right? Releasing others from their debt. It's the bare minimum. I heard actually just yesterday, forgiveness is a lot like marriage. Releasing others from their debt is like the wedding day. And then the real work begins. And so next week and the week after, we are going to look at the rest of marriage. But today we're just focusing on the wedding day. All right? It's just releasing others from their debt. And so for now, I think it's enough to just stop there, and I'm going to ask the band to come up, and I'm going to ask all of us to stand as we close with communion this morning.